Visual agnosia. Visual agnosia is a rare vision-related disorder where the affected individual has trouble recognizing objects. They can still technically see something that's in front of them, but they can't identify what the object is, or at least identify it correctly.
I see colours, shapes, punctuated by faces, the faces of people which I really recognise, and they stand out much more than anything else. That's why I can't read words or read music anymore. So I still can imagine what it looks like in my mind's eye, but I can't imagine what it looks like, or I can't see what it looks like when I look at it. So essentially, I find things through colour.
Someone suffering from visual agnosia might see a chair and mistake it for a small child. Though this is an extreme example. In most cases, the patient often confuses an object with something of a similar general shape, like seeing a pink smartphone and believing that it's a bar of soap. There are also several subcategories of this disorder for people who have difficulty perceiving a certain type of object. People suffering from alexia, for example, cannot distinguish between different words and see all text as essentially the same thing. Similarly, patients with environmental agnosia have trouble recognizing their surroundings, which makes it almost impossible for them to go anywhere on their own. Visual agnosia is fascinating not just because of how it affects perception, but because it gives us a glimpse into the intricate workings of the brain and what happens when those processes break down. In rare cases, it can be triggered by trauma, such as a head injury or stroke. However, the more common cause is simply aging, particularly in conditions like dementia that impact the brain's ability to process and interpret visual information. It's not like the patient wakes up one day and is unable to recognize the objects around them. Instead, it starts off small with occasional misidentifications before growing rapidly with age. And this is precisely what happens to the most popular case of visual agnosia, which was documented by the neurologist Oliver Sacks in his book titled The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. The title of the book is also in reference to the person suffering from visual agnosia, who Oliver referred to as Mr. P, who I'll just call Peter for simplicity's sake. Now, Peter was a singer and a musician who became a music teacher in his later years, and it was during his time at school that the first signs of his visual issues began to appear. Sometimes a student would stand in front of him and Peter wouldn't recognize them. More specifically, he wouldn't recognize the student's face. It would stay that way until the student spoke, at which point Peter could identify them by their voice. This often caused misunderstandings and frustrations for Peter, but he often laughed it off and didn't pay much attention to it. However, his situation became a whole lot worse as time went on. Not only was he failing to identify the faces around him, but he also began to see faces where there were none. It got to the point that on some occasions he patted things like fire hydrants and parking meters thinking that they were his students. But this blurring of reality didn't stop there. As the condition progressed, Peter became increasingly delusional. He began speaking to ornate carvings on chairs, expecting a response, and expressing surprise when none came. This went on for nearly 3 years as Peter kept ignoring the issue and deluding himself into thinking that it was normal. And it wasn't until Peter developed diabetes and sought help from an ophthalmologist, concerned that his eyesight might be failing, that the truth came out. Fortunately, after hearing Peter's bizarre and fragmented descriptions of his vision, the ophthalmologist realized the problem wasn't with Peter's eyes, but with his brain. He referred Peter to Oliver Sacks for further diagnosis. Upon his visit, Oliver gave him a National Geographic magazine and asked him to describe what he saw in it. According to the case report, Peter was able to discern finer details like colors, brightness, and shapes of objects in a scene. But when asked to describe the scene as a whole, his mind drew a blank. However, the most bizarre part of his visit came near the end when Peter was about to leave. He reached out and grabbed the head of his wife, who came with him, and tried to put her on his head. In other words, Peter had just misidentified his own wife as a literal hat. This confirmed beyond a doubt that Peter was dealing with visual agnosia. And unfortunately, while the diagnosis was accurate, Oliver had no treatment to offer that could improve his condition. With no other choice, Peter adapted by relying on his other senses to recognize people for the rest of his life. It goes to show just how adaptable humans are, even when faced with something as terrifying as visual agnosia.
Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Until next time.